Hello and welcome to another chess guess video, and today let's see if you can guess Bobby Fischer's moves. This game was played at the Manhattan Chess Club in New York in 1971. So here Bobby Fischer had the black pieces. You can try and guess the opponent's moves as well, but his opponent begins with d4. Now Fischer, he responds with g6. All right, so from here on out, this starts out with a modern defense, but let's see how the game progresses and see if you can figure out Bobby Fischer's moves. His opponent plays c4, grabbing a big share of the center with these pawns pushed forward. Fischer fianchettos the bishop, so hopefully you figured that out. If he was going to push the g-pawn, that's probably because he wants to put the bishop here and aim through the center towards the queen side. All right, now we have knight to c3, a common move when you push the d and c pawns. Bring the knight in behind that c pawn, and it helps control the center here. The game continues with knight to f6, and now we've transposed into a King's Indian defense, which Bobby Fischer was very famous for playing throughout his career with the black pieces against the d4 pawn openings. So the game continues with e4, taking a bigger share of the center with all these pawns. You know, they're covering a lot of valuable squares. Now here, what do you think Fischer should play? Fischer plays d6. So this is a common move in the King's Indian defense because you don't want that pawn pushing forward and chasing your knight. You know, the pawn could still push forward, but at least now you would be able to capture. And if he would recapture, well, then you could knock out the queen. All right, so the game continues with bishop to e2 here. And now what does Fischer play next? Well, hopefully you figured out his next move, castling. So these are all book moves, standard development in the King's Indian defense. You want to fianchetto the bishop, bring the knight to f6, push that d pawn up if your opponent is threatening to push his e pawn, and then get your king castled to safety. So already Fischer's king is safe, and his opponent's is still hanging out in the middle of the board. So now we have knight to f3, and white is ready to castle his king. So the game continues with Fischer pushing pawn to e5. So maybe you guessed that move, especially if you play the King's Indian defense, because this is a common way to push forward. Now, if we go back, we see that all these strong pawns in the center, they're controlling a lot of real estate. So at some point, black needs to fight back in the center by pushing this pawn or maybe pushing this one. Fischer chooses the e pawn, and now white has options. You can try and guess what they may do here. White goes ahead and castles. They could have captured, they could have pushed forward here. Many possibilities, but this kind of leaves the tension in the center, and now Fischer has to figure out what he should play. So Fischer develops the knight. Now this entices his opponent to push forward, locking the center, but chasing that knight, and then the knight can reposition to e7 here. Let's see if his opponent does that or not. Yes, he pushes forward, and now you should know where that knight is probably going to go. Yes, he retreats back to e7, and now the game continues with knight dropping back. Now this move looks strange, but what that does is free up this f pawn to be able to push forward, attacking the center here. So What do you think Fischer should do against this? Well, he drops his knight back, because if this f-pawn pushes forward, now the knight protects it, the bishop protects it, and there are other options as well. So let's see what white does. White decides not to attack with that pawn immediately, but reposition this knight closer to the center here. That also may prevent this knight from jumping up here in the future. And Fischer goes ahead and throws his f-pawn forward first. Now we have capture, and apparently that's a mistake for white to capture there. It probably would have been better for him to push his f-pawn and guard. So now what does Fischer do? Fischer captures towards the center with his pawn, keeping his pawn chain together, but possibly opening up the G file towards white's king. And if he would have captured with a knight, well, there could have been the possibility of an attack against that knight. But let's see how white continues. White presses forward, putting a little bit of pressure on the center here. That could entice Fischer to move forward and attack the knight. Let's see what he does. He ignores that in favor of developing his knight, and apparently this is the best move according to the computer. Fischer's opponent develops a bishop, and now we have the other knight developing. So you see the pattern here. Fischer is slowly improving the position of his pieces. Now, queen to c2. Apparently that's an inaccuracy. Let's see how Fischer responds to that. Fischer centralizes his rook. So perhaps threatening to capture with a discovered attack on that unprotected bishop, and that would force the bishop to recapture, and then Fischer could knock out his opponent's bishop pair by capturing with the knight. So we have a capture first by white. Now what will Fischer do here? Well, hopefully you figured out that he does not want to capture with the rook, of course, or the knight can capture. So what does Fischer do? He captures with the pawn. And so now these pawns, this pair of pawns has the possibility of pushing forward, chasing back the bishop, then maybe going after the knight. The pawns can start pushing forward, attacking white's position. So bishop presses forward, pinning the knight to the queen. So how does Fischer handle that? He attacks the bishop, immediately putting the question to that bishop. And now we have capture, giving up the bishop pair. Fischer recaptures with the queen. Now, even though the rook is lined up on that queen, Fischer does develop his queen off the back rank. So now the game continues with a counterattack over here on the queen side, putting pressure on that pawn so that the bishop cannot develop, or that pawn could be captured. So how does Fischer handle that? He ignores that and attacks in the center, putting pressure on the knight. And now we have knight stepping forward in inaccuracy. What does Fischer do? He knocks that knight out. Rook recaptures. And now what should Fischer do? What do you think Fischer should play at this point? He attacks the rook and lines his queen up directly against the king. Now, even though there's a pawn in between, you never know. what could happen in the future. And it's, in general, a good strategy to line up a less valuable piece on a more valuable piece, even with other pieces in between. So now we have the rook dropping back. Queen delivers a check here. Now, computer says there was a missed opportunity here. Now, what should Fischer have done? If we take a look at this and try and see why Fischer made this move, either the rook will have to block the attack or the king will move into the corner. But there could be a possible threat of knocking out the knight and then picking off the bishop here. So that's a possibility. Let's see what Fischer's opponent does. Now that's if the rook does not move up here and defend the bishop. King into the corner, and now Fischer decides not to go after that and then go after the bishop. Maybe that's why this was considered a mistake. Fischer probably wanted to keep this defensive bishop here around his king. All right, so the game continues with pawn pushing forward, and now there's a threat of pushing this pawn with a discovered attack on the king. That's why I was saying it's good to have a less valuable piece like the queen lined up on the king. And when I say less valuable, I mean compared to the king. The king is always the most valuable piece because if it's checkmated, you lose. All right, king into the corner. And this is probably why Fischer decided to decline the capture of this knight and then the queen capturing the bishop. It may give his opponent some counterplay. So the rook heads into the center. What does Fischer do now? He centralizes his bishop, aiming at white's king side over here. So maybe in the future there could be some threats if the queen lines up on the h-file and threatens a mate in one. Pawn is pushed forward, blocking the scope of that bishop. We have rook also grabbing the half open file. And the game continues with knight retreat. A missed opportunity here. So not the best move for white. So what does Fischer do in this position? He presses the pawn forward, trying to open things up around his opponent's king. So after rook sidesteps, now if the pawn captures, the rook could... I guess the rook does not want to capture because then the bishop could capture, so the pawn would probably have to capture. Let's see what happens. We have a pawn push attacking the bishop. Bishop repositions, and now there's a threat to the rook once this pawn pushes forward. What does Fischer do? He lines up on the king here. So it's starting to look dangerous for Fischer's opponent's king here. Queen centralizes. Now we have a rook sacrifice. So that move may have been hard to see, especially for you beginners, but after queen capture, this is a mistake. So, after this is done, I could do a quick game review and it'll kind of highlight what all these mistakes are and what could have been played better. But I'm just trying to get through the game for those of you that just want to see the moves quickly. All right. Queen captures in the center, and now we have the final move. A brilliant move by Fischer. So this is where the game ended. Now, I'll go back. I'm going to do the game review, and then we can look at this and see what white could have done here. Especially the beginners that are saying, wait a minute, that queen's not even protected. The king could just capture that queen. Yes, the king could capture, but then it would lead to a mate because the bishop is lined up here on the king, and we would have a double discovered check when the rook moves here, checking by both the rook and the bishop at the same time, and this bishop here would cut off the escape. So the king would have to move back in the corner, and then the rook could just reposition to h2. I'll show you that after we do this review. So here's the game review. It looks like Fischer played at 87.7% accuracy versus 76 by his opponent. This wasn't a high, it's still pretty accurate, but it wasn't in the 90th percentile range like some other Fischer games. But it was kind of an interesting King's Indian game with a nice little ending here. So that's why I wanted to show you all this game today. All right, so the bad moves. Fischer had 0 inaccuracies. His opponent had 4. Fischer did make 3 mistakes, and his opponent made 5, and they both had 1 missed opportunity. Fischer played at a 2400 level in this game, and his opponent played at 2000. Now, this was at a club game. I don't know if it was just a random game, if it was part of a little tournament, or what. It might have just been a friendly game or a blitz game. I'm not sure. So, let's do this review from the beginning and see what the computer actually says. You go back to the beginning here. All right, review. I don't want to share. I want to actually see the moves here. Okay, here we go. So it'll zip through the moves until we get to something interesting, and that way I can cover anything that I missed. So this was a mistake. Apparently it would have been better to push that pawn and just fortify. And a lot of times there's that rule to take is a mistake. Sometimes it's better to hold the tension in the position and just improve. So instead of capturing and releasing the tension between the pieces or pawns, it's better to just defend or improve the position of your pieces. Or counterattack sometimes. All right. So now, this was a mistake. Apparently, best would have been what? Instead of rook to e8, better would have been knight up to e4, according to the computer anyway. But I can kind of see why Fischer would not want to do that. The knight could attack or capture knight here. If Fischer recaptures, it probably gives his opponent some counterplay. And Fischer was known for, if he had 2 or more options, he would usually go with the safer option if he knew that it would still give him an advantage compared to a less certain option and he wasn't sure what would happen in that. He would usually go for the safer option if it still gave him an advantage. All right, on to the next moves here. Okay, this is a mistake. Apparently it would have been better to just put the king in the corner earlier. All right, so a great move here. And here it would have been better to double up the rooks instead. Because that would have activated the other rook. Bring this rook in the that's in the corner doing nothing. Bring it in towards the action. All right, this move was a mistake. It looks like, wow, it would have been better to just immediately knock out that knight. Okay. So what happened next? This was a mistake. Once again, it's saying, oh no, actually, instead of retreating the queen, it would have been better to just bring that king into the corner immediately to get it out of the way of possible line of fire here. And it says show a missed tactic. Oh, I don't know. That looks kind of crazy. Man, I guess that's something the computer is highlighting. But anyway, back to the game. What else is being played here? This move was a mistake. It would have been better to push this pawn forward. All right, now Fischer, according to the computer, played a mistake by doing this. Instead, recommended is immediately attacking with the bishop. Oh, wow. Let's see what the follow-up to that would be. Huh. All right, interesting way the game could have progressed, but like I said, maybe Fischer felt that that was not entirely clear. So maybe it wasn't clear enough for Fischer to go into that line. So he just played something that he thought was still good for him. So let's see what actually happened. All right. Computer does not like that move. Apparently it would have been better to just knock out this rook. But already it's looking a little bit grim here for white. So we get to this move, and that allows Fischer to play that. This brilliant move in the end here. So, if you were asking, well, what could happen here? The only move possible is to capture. And now, if I turn on this analysis, it's mate in 1 with rook to h3. Also, there was this possibility of a double attack here. A double discovered check and then swinging over to here. But this is even quicker. Mate because of the bishops. And of course, this pawn is helping as well. All right, there you have it. Feel free to leave comments, like and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.